Hello from Dr. Kate. You might have thought after listening to the part one of survey methodology that there couldn't possibly be more to talk about, but guess what? Here we go with part two. We're talking about different levels of data to collect via your surveys. And let's talk a bit about ratio, which is the last type to discuss. You probably remember that the ratio level data has a significant, meaningful 0 point. So what kinds of questions would have ratio level data? That would be questions about frequencies, how often you've done some kind of activity, for example. Later, what we end up having to do is what we call clean the data, because when you ask people to, rather than check a range for, let's say, income, you ask them to write it out, you're going to find that you're going to get weird answers. Some answers that are so outlandish that we would call them outliers. Outliers are pieces of data that are just not either believable or are so off the mark from everyone else that to include them could skew your average quite a bit. As an example, I was asking students in that ALS Ice Bucket Challenge survey to provide dollar amount for their contributions to charity. And there was one person that indicated $10,000 was how much they had contributed to charity in the last calendar year. Now, while that might be possible, the next highest was, I believe, somewhere around the $100 amount. So having that wide of a spread would throw off the average, particularly because not very many students in total are able to make cash contributions for charity. So those type of examples of outliers are things that you just eliminate from the data. Ratio level data is valuable because you can use it, create averages or means, and then make comparisons using other kinds of tests that aren't possible when you just have categories like ordinal level data. What we can do, and what I can always do for you, is create categories later. That's why one of those rules for surveys is that you ask for raw data as much as possible, like ratio level data, and I can always create categories of, we'll use the contributions example again to charity. I'd have $0 donated, perhaps $1 to, depending on how the data appeared, maybe between $1 and $25, and then $26 to $50, and so on. I'd first look at the data and see how it spread out the contributions, and then make a few categories out of that, which then takes it from a ratio level data to ordinal level data. And that's fine for additional analyses. Now let's talk about some groups that are often used in the survey methodology. You may have heard of a cohort, and a cohort means it's a group that has at least one common characteristic. In my work with injection drug users, they are considered a cohort, and that is their defining characteristic as a group. Think about when you enrolled here at UW-Whitewater, you were a cohort. You'd be considered those all entering, let's say, assuming you did it as a freshman, which I know some of you haven't, but let's say you all came in freshmen in a certain year. That's your cohort that's going to be followed to gather data on you throughout your career here at UWW. If you're a transfer student, that's another cohort. And again, the characteristic that you have in common is that you amassed credits at another institution of higher learning prior to coming to UW Whitewater. I did a study with students who happened to be ending up at Marquette University while I was there as a visiting professor back in 2005, 2006. If you remember anything about Hurricane Katrina, it happened to hit in New Orleans right at the beginning of the semester. And around Labor Day weekend, when students were just starting to come back to school on campuses in New Orleans, when there was kind of the after wave of the flooding that had occurred related to the hurricane, suddenly thousands and thousands of students ended up being sent home, which was what we mean by displaced. And then they had to decide, so if I'm going to go to school, where am I going to go to school? And about, as I recall, perhaps 40 students ended up transferring over to Marquette, coming in late, of course, for the semester. But that's a cohort that I was interested in studying. In particular, how did they make the decision to come to Marquette and what kinds of information was available to them as the storm was approaching, as it hit, and how did they find out about it being closed as far as universities and that people needed to evacuate. Now, while students had phones at this time, this is pre-smartphone technology, and it was really interesting to hear how some students just had no idea what was going on because they were not at all plugged in to any media reports, let's say during CNN or weather channels or anything like that, whereas pretty much the rest of the country knew exactly what was going on. But maybe it was because they were moving and it was a new, exciting time. They just were not paying attention, as well as universities weren't putting things on their websites either. But that's for another day and time's discussion if we can. So for the Katrina students at Marquette, I asked the university to be able to reach out to that population. Again, it was only about 40, so I wasn't going to do a random sampling of that population. I wanted to reach out to each of them to see if they'd be willing to do a focus group, which we'll talk about later what that methodology is, as well as a survey. If it was a larger cohort, like all incoming freshmen from, we could say, this academic year at UWW, I could definitely get a random sample of that larger group of approximately 2,000 students, but they all still are a cohort because they share that same. If we want to assess that group, that cohort, what we could talk about as far as a survey design is measuring different dependent variables and how they have changed over time. So for a college group, maybe we'd be asking them about their involvement on campus in various organizations from freshman, sophomore, junior, and then for the exit survey when they're graduating. We can certainly measure things like GPA and stuff that is readily available through the registrar, but we might also ask for other pieces of data of them directly annually to see what occurs with students over time. Might be related to their employment status from one year to the next and whatever else somebody might think is relevant. Now, some things we call the cohort effect are just likely to occur due to the population growing older. So if I wanted to ask about internships, that is going to be more likely as you're an upperclassman than a lowerclassman. So I can't say, oh, it's because you over time somehow get the urge to do internships. It's really more like, well, you can't get an internship until you've gone through certain courses and or it's part of a curriculum. So that's the kind of thing we talk about. Aging might be the reason that there is a change over time in a cohort. I was working with a study of boys and girls clubs around the country, and it was topic wise abstinence until marriage. So the acronym is actually AOM, abstinence only until marriage, as far as having sexual activities. This was an intervention kind of project. So the students in the Boys and Girls Clubs were given a pretest, and then after being exposed to the intervention materials, were given a post-test. So we were looking for changes over time. And again, there's a maturation effect because you are more likely to engage in sexual activities the older you get. You can't, this is one of those things you can't take back, right? So there, just by passage of time, there's going to be more people engaging in sexual activities, even or despite having been exposed to intervention material saying, hey, abstinence only until marriage is cool. I always wonder about the data that I see that breaks out teens between 13 and 19 years old. Because, a 13-year-old and their behaviors and actions and attitudes are quite a bit different from 18 and 19-year-olds who are legally adults. So I always wonder why we don't just, in all these reports that I read, break out the data between 13 to 17 years old. One reason might be that they didn't ask for that information. Maybe it was just an age category, so people checked the box. But it seems to me those adults, young adults, though they might be, probably have a lot different set of expectations and attitudes about how they're going to navigate the world than those who are minors. So when you see teen birth rate data, it typically is presented between 13 and 19-year-olds, whereas the adults certainly have, it's not surprising if you're going to have a child, but again, it kind of artificially inflates teen birth rate by including adults in there. And that's why I say here, why don't you just break out the data? Again, maybe because you didn't ask it, so you can't do it. You might have in your schooling throughout your life been part of the YRBS, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. This is conducted every couple years in selected schools around the country and asks, honestly, a boatload of information about behaviors. This is what would be called secondary data. I want to take a look at how Wisconsin shakes out in their reports of alcohol use or tobacco use or whatever other things I might be interested in. That would be a cohort. They're going to follow various locations and students throughout their academic careers. So they are a cohort. If you're able to use this secondary data, which something like this Youth Risk Behavior Survey is actually available online, that's a good way to do some data analysis on the cheap rather than collecting your own data. So applying this to more real-world circumstances, a PR firm could follow a target population over time as whatever characteristics they desire to put it into a cohort. Doesn't just have to be age, could be many other kinds of demographics, and see how successful a campaign or an advertising fleet of ads was with a particular group over time. And when you do that kind of an analysis, it can be evident afterward that there really are changes in that group that might be tied to other things going on societally, such as the legalization of marijuana in many states. Also, relatively recently, legalization of gay marriage in most states. What's going on politically with who's in power. Are you a red state? Are you a blue state? What's going on in the nation, some kind of economic situations happening. All those kinds of things when you're looking at over time what's going on in a cohort can possibly provide you with some explanations. Cohorts aren't what we would like to call clean with our data. The reason is that there's nowhere to go but down with your group. You start out, we'll just say a cohort of 25 people. Inevitably, people are going to leave, possibly for legit reasons. People have a way of dying inconveniently, and so you can't bring them back from the dead to ask them questions. Depending on what kind of a cohort you have, for different things that you might be asking, you might have empty or near empty cells of information. So that's going to give you, when you run an analysis, if there's 0 people, like counts in a cell, the computer is going to say, oh, well, that's statistically significant. But what it really is you just don't have enough people to do that kind of an analysis. So our cohort, whoever it is what it is. We don't know if they're a good cohort. Are they representative? That's what I mean by good. So, it could be a bad sample to begin with, and now we're going to carry it out and see how they're doing over time. We can't control. It's not an experiment. This is real life. There's a documentary series that my brother is very fond of called 7 Up, I believe, and it was following a cohort every 7 years, and they would create a documentary out of it, and I think they were at least at 49 years. So it was 7 Up times 7 or something like that. So that's an amazing amount of time to be following someone, but you can't control it. So here's an example of a birth cohort. So we're looking at age ranges, and we're looking at over time, percentage-wise, who regularly reads a news magazine. Of course, back in this time, it was probably print rather than online. So you can see, just look at 1992, how the youngest age category has only 15% versus 34% versus 48%. And that age group of 26 to 29 in the year 1996 still is 44%, which goes down to 2000 to 35%. What's happening over time? Well, our technology has changed quite a bit over time, so that definitely is a characteristic that we can't control, but relates to what we're looking at here. A cross-sectional way of doing measures with surveys means that you're going to compare groups various groups at one point in time. You could really only compare two groups if that's all you had. I see I have three groups here on the slide itself. We're going to look to see, are there differences with this group? And here is an example of what is called a pure cohort effect. So imagine the first group, 18 to 21, whatever the measure is, and it doesn't really matter, it's just some data in the table. But can you see how the 18 to 21-year-old group in 1992, they become the 22 to 25-year-old group in 1996 and move to the 26 to 29-year-old group for the year 2000, and how that, whatever they're measuring, it stays the same. And you can see that with the 22 to 25-year-old group, how that 20 number is the same in 1996 as well. So that's called the pure cohort effect. Whatever this is about, even over time, it's not changing because it's the same group. The only difference is they're older. Now, a trend analysis is taking a look at the example you're going to see shortly at 3 different time frames and see what trends you might be able to pick up over the data. Each year we're talking about here would be called a period effect, meaning like a point in time. So a pure period effect in 1992, it doesn't matter how old you are, it's the same result on whatever that dependent variable measure is. Same thing with 96, same thing with 2000. All perfect data, which we never see. Now, when we want to look at one cohort over time, do we want to look at aging, if that matters? And that would also be called maturation effect, as I mentioned. So purely by age, when we're looking the rows across, that the 18 to 21-year-olds, whatever this measure is, are consistent. Same with 22 to 25, same with 26 to 29. So these are across years, yet whatever this measure happens to be is the same by age category. And again, if only life were this easy and perfect for researchers who like to look at data. And why I'm saying that is because of the simplicity of these examples. It's showing one independent variable, which is your age range, is associated entirely with what happens with the dependent variable. And again, this is human behavior and is not correct, but for illustrative purposes only. This would be more like something you might see. We're taking a look here at 3 different years, 72, 82, and 91. Why it's not 92, who knows? However, what is it they're looking at? Cohort analysis of daily newspaper reading, which means the percent of people reading a newspaper every day by age category. So we look across at the 18 to 22-year-olds. We see going across that the number declines from 47% down to 20%. If we look at the bottom group, 38 to 42, over time, from 78% down to 60%. And then we see that 28 to 32-year-olds seem to break that pattern where they had 66% in 72, 55% in 82, down to 39% in 91. And that's really what the question is. I would be interested in as a researcher. What's going on there? What was happening in somewhere around 1982 that would lead the 28 to 32-year-olds to be reading a newspaper daily, more so even than their older counterparts? There's a question for you to ponder if you so desire. But before I move on, take a look down the columns 72, 82, 91. And we can see the pattern of the younger you are, the less you are reading newspapers daily, regardless of what year the data is collected. And overall, except for that 1982 year, the older you are, the more you are reading daily newspapers, which also doesn't, become a very surprising result. Let's talk about panel studies, where we're using people and taking measures at different points in time. And the most familiar probably to you is if you're part of a Nielsen family. Now, the Nielsen family was the way to collect data for particularly television use in households in the United States. Another example of a panel study would be if I were able to track injection drug users that I brought into a study at multiple points in time. That's a panel study. Now back to the Nielsen family. When there weren't that many channels to choose from, like back in the day when I first was familiar with these, we would have, let's see, the three main networks, and a little later than that, Fox, and also a PBS station, and probably some independent station as well in most markets. So you had very little to choose from, maybe 5, 6, something like that, channels. So you didn't really need a huge amount of people willing to be connected with the Nielsen tracking service. That would be a device put on their television sets. It first started out written and then moved to, as technology advanced, to electronic monitoring of what your family's doing. Same thing with college students being tracked each year on their retention at the university, their GPAs, their whatever, other kinds of questions. Another panel example was going on when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Medical College of Wisconsin's Center for AIDS Intervention Research. They were asking individuals at risk for HIV to fill out a diary, a literal diary, not with a fuzzy cover or anything, but just a paper document with self-addressed stamped envelopes. And the question was to do this every day and indicate if you had or had not had any kind of sexual activity, what type, and if you used protection. That's it. So first question would be, are people really going to tell you the truth? Are they going to do it daily? Are they going to kind of store up a bunch of these and then just send them in at the same time? Answer, the last one. They'd send in a week or 2 weeks all at once and kind of guess at if they did or did not have some kind of sexual relations during that time frame. So the question is this really, are people really going to be honest? Because you are being tracked, and why would you admit things like that? But that's why, like a lot of times with research, the initial things that you collect, you don't even count because you assume people are going to have to take some time to get used to it. Just like with Nielsen families, when people first start out, they usually watch a lot of PBS and other kinds of stations they think you want them to say that they watch. and then they get into their regular routine later on. Doing a panel lets you have better data analysis of a particular group. And as I just mentioned, the early surveys are often tossed in favor of waiting for folks to get used to however the data collection process is. Presumably, there's better control over the situation. Not good control, just better than no control. But the main problem is there's a lot of expense associated with running panel studies. In fact, just to start out, many people, if you approach them, they'll just say, no thanks, I don't want to be part of this, which is an issue because the people who actually will agree probably are at least qualitatively different from folks who refuse you outright. And the dropout rate is pretty high, which is why the payment, as far as a scale for this, usually it increases the longer it goes on to try to encourage people to please stick with you as part of the study. Desensitization means that after a while, whatever you might be exposing someone to, it just doesn't impact them that much. This term is used a lot in the violence literature, that if you keep looking at, and this is what researchers found, if you keep looking at violent videos, that what you're seeing is not bothering you so much because you've seen it before. Which is probably why, like in films and video games and so on, they'll try to do, bigger and better acts of violence so that it is unusual and it'll kind of attract you, keep your interest. Now, because for your samples, anything you're doing over time, there's nowhere to go but down, that's called attrition rate. How many people have you lost due to lack of interest? Maybe if it's in a geographic area, they move, so now they're no longer part of it. They're college students, they drop out or go to another university. That's all what gets calculated in to attrition rate, and it always is going to go down. We did a panel study that I was tangentially involved in with severely mentally ill individuals, that's SMI, while I was at the medical college. We were asking folks to give us contacts for people that they are close to, because people with severe mental illness often drop out of sight. So if that were the case, then maybe we could call someone else to try to find them. And what we did find was that these people in the study would give us names of doctors, for example, as like their close contact, which is kind of sad if you think about it, or a family member or a friend. And what is also the case with SMI folks is they tend to break off contact with people for real or imagined reasons. If someone that they were close to, now they no longer talk to, which is why we try to get multiple contacts. And in that study, ended up losing 50% of those that had enrolled in the study just because of that, like dropping out of sight, and who they gave us as contacts have no idea where they are. If we use aggression or violence as a dependent variable, and we want some kind of exposure to violent media as the independent variable, my point here is you would not just collect that piece of information. You'd also want to see, well, what else you think might be related to aggressive or violent behavior, the dependent variable. And if it was a sample of boys between 7 and 10, what if you're reading an article you might find is that they're saying they're measuring in waves. That just means time 1 Time 2, time 3. Multiple measures of the same population. If instead you want a group to kind of think back and remember what went on in the last month. That's why the diary example I gave you was used in the hopes of people having a much more accurate recall of their sexual activities and risk behaviors if you complete something on the daily instead of thinking back a month ago. We don't have good memories or recall. We're highly inaccurate, as a matter of fact. So, and we'll tend to round up, how many times? Oh, 10 times, just to say something. You might also have as a design, instead of the retrospective, a catch-up method where you have your original data that you use, and then maybe you go back and talk to these participants, as many as you can, 6 months later. And you might find that things have changed. And you might find, well, even though we didn't ask about this or measure something, now it's a very pertinent, relevant piece of data to gather. I'm thinking here about something like a Fitbit, where for a while, those were just a new thing, and then all of a sudden they hit big in the market, and many, many people had those. And if I was doing this study somehow on physical activity and not having any information about if one has a Fitbit or a smartwatch now to measure that kind of activity, that I'd be missing an important piece of information that really wasn't around 3 years ago or so as a technology. A lot of what we're going to do now is just show and tell. I just want to show you some examples of surveys that have been sent to me for various reasons. This would be a typical, it's just like a postcard size. They are asking me, for some reason, I'd been to radiology, and so I'm supposed to check a box, what type of service did I receive? Hopefully you can recognize this is nominal level data. It's just a type. And here we've got a Likert type scale with a series of items. We're from very satisfied to very dissatisfied, except for the last question, which is very likely to very unlikely. And they've got some questions in italics for whatever reason. I don't know if it's just to draw your eye to them, or maybe that would help you with fatigue of taking the survey, that you see those are different questions. Now, one point that a statistician might raise is, why do you have to be very satisfied or very dissatisfied? Aren't the opposites really satisfied and dissatisfied? And then maybe instead, shouldn't it be satisfied, somewhat satisfied, and then I'd say neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and then add in a slightly dissatisfied. That's probably what I would do. The same with from the very likely to very unlikely. Some would say, well, likely and unlikely are the opposites. So you build from those opposites in. And of course, they always want open-ended comments. I think it's funny. It says your name's optional, but your phone number it doesn't say. But regardless, I usually don't put anything down when people ask me for comments, because I think you should pay me if you want more information. They claim United Healthcare that this was a 20-minute survey, and they were dead wrong about it. Again, we don't have to go through each of these items at all, but what you can see with the first question, you see where it says check yes, and if you do that, you go to question number 3. That's called a skip pattern that you can build into surveys that you do online. It's more awkward when you're doing it here on paper because everybody's seeing questions they don't necessarily have to answer. So we've got all sorts of questions with Likert type scales. You see here with number 10, asking about starting or stopping a prescription medication. How much did the doctor or whoever talk about reasons why? And they go, not at all, a little, some, a lot. Now, I don't know what the difference between a little and some is. And to me, that's a bad question. You can see also they are only having 4 choices, so they want it to be that you're on one side or the other. There's no middle ground, which I think there could also be, even if it's not in the middle, like I don't recall as an option. But they don't have that. And you can see other types, they keep changing what the scale is, like number 13 from 0 to 10, which is actually an 11-point scale. What's your number would you use to rate all your health care in the last 12 months? And somewhere along that continuum, you would put your check mark. And you can take a look at these if you want to pause at this point just to get examples of different kinds of questions. Number 14A is pretty involved in that they only want you to check one of all those possibilities. So it started giving me a headache at this point. But I want to point out for 14B, the problem there is when they start asking, when you need care, how long did you have to wait? And they start out same day, so you're not waiting, 1 day, 2 day, 3 days, and then see what they do when they create the ranges. That's what's going to make a problem for you to do any kind of decent data analysis later. So they've now messed up the results, in my opinion. Oftentimes there'll be these self-reports like number 44 of your physical and or mental health that you're giving your own self-report of that. And it's typically that excellent to poor. Anything else? Well, there's a couple that put a don't know in there about flu shots, about aspirin, number 50. And again, this took quite a while, so what I did was chuck it in the garbage. And then my husband pulled it out and finished it for me, which I thought was kind of funny, just because he probably didn't know the answers anyway. So with whoever in Virginia got this piece of garbage sent to them, that was filled out by 2 of us. And do you see number 59, that question, using age ranges? You're going to have problems. Why would you do that when you can just say, what's your age? I got this follow-up postcard, which is important in that the United Healthcare sent out X number of surveys. They want to get as many back as possible because they want to get a good return rate, which was what I went over in that earlier lecture. Now, they know darn well if you did or did not send the survey back in, because on the front page there's coding, kind of tracking information, and they are not going to mail out postcard reminders to everybody. They're going to mail them out to those that really didn't receive it. So that second sentence, if you have already completed it, thank you, is just baloney. But anyway, that it's worth it to them to spare or to spend that amount of money to try to get more people to do the survey itself. Here's a survey that was sent to me to complete that was a little bit unusual because it was crafted and administered by an outside research firm, and we were wondering as a group, would we be sent this kind of a survey? Here it is. First question is bad, in my humble opinion. So if you read it, would you say that UW-Whitewater is similar to or different from other universities, public or private, that you are familiar with? What on earth does that even mean? So I kind of laughed just to start with this. They then want you to check for each of these characteristics how the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater falls from excellent to poor on multiple characteristics. Then you're supposed to select 4 of those characteristics to say, I think these are kind of like discriminators or things that really stand out about UW-Whitewater's personality, if a university can have a personality. And here I'll share a survey I received. They were asking me to talk about teaching public speaking, and I've done that quite a bit.